The third cup of coffee trembled in Katie Morrison's hands as she poured it at 2:08 a.m., the liquid sloshing against the ceramic rim. The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart Hospital's break room hummed their mechanical dirge, casting her face in harsh white that made the thin scar along her jawline look deeper than it was. She set the cup down slowly, pressing her palms flat against the counter to steady them. The tremor wasn't new. Shrapnel lived in her right shoulder, 3 fragments the surgeons decided were safer left alone than dug out, and on nights like this, when her body remembered things her mind tried to forget, the trembling came. She pressed her fingers against the fabric of her scrubs, feeling the weight of the faded unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket, folded on the chair behind her. Special Forces insignia. Her own. The one thing she carried that no one here knew existed. The night shift at Sacred Heart in Houston was quiet, that particular 3 a.m. quiet where the world felt smaller, as if the hospital existed in its own pocket dimension where normal rules bent slightly. Katie had worked this shift for 18 months, long enough that most of the staff had stopped asking her name and started calling her the night nurse or worse, just Morrison. She didn't correct them. Invisibility was a skill, and she had spent enough years being visible to appreciate the alternative. Her name tag read simply Nurse Morrison, nothing more. No title. No history. Just a woman in blue scrubs with trembling hands and a limp she'd learned to hide by favoring her left side when she walked. She took a long breath and picked the coffee back up, gripping it with both hands now. Her left hand was steady as a surgical laser, but she held it anyway because sometimes steadiness came from anchoring yourself to something that wouldn't let you fall. Her left eye caught the shift roster on the bulletin board, night skeleton crew, standard for midweek. 3 nurses. 2 techs. 1 ER physician on call. She'd worked with worse odds. She'd survived worse odds. The smell of burnt coffee mixed with antiseptic as she moved back toward the nurse's station, her limp barely visible now. Muscle memory. 5 years of walking clinics and hospital corridors had taught her how to disappear into the background, how to move like someone who didn't want to be remembered. The tile floor clicked softly beneath her shoes, regulation nursing clogs, sensible, forgettable. She was halfway through reviewing the 11 p.m. patient charts when the ER doors burst open and the night fractured into pieces. Paramedics rushed in at full sprint, their voices overlapping in controlled chaos. 28-year-old male, high-impact training accident, loss of consciousness at scene, vitals en route, the gurney hit the trauma bay with a bang that echoed through the corridor. Monitors screaming. Hands moving. The organized panic of a body in crisis. Katie moved toward the bay on instinct, already reading the vitals board before she consciously decided to look. Blood pressure dropping. Oxygen saturation in free fall. Heart rate elevated and climbing. The standard catastrophe of blunt force trauma. And then she saw the file. The paramedic handed off the chart to the charge nurse, and Katie caught sight of a name printed in bold across the top, General Marcus Webb, United States Special Forces Command. Age 28. Profoundly deaf, bilateral sensorineural hearing loss documented, ASL fluency noted, communication requirements flagged in red. Training accident, location classified, time down unknown. Next of kin listed as Sarah Webb, his daughter. Katie's pen stopped moving. Her right hand, the trembling one, went very still. She watched it happen from somewhere outside her own body, that strange dissociation that came when your past walked in on a stretcher unconscious and bleeding. The coffee cup rested forgotten on the edge of the chart rack. Marcus Webb. General Marcus Webb. The same face she hadn't seen in 5 years, older now, harder now, but unmistakable. The jaw. The scar tissue along his left temple. The tattoo on his visible wrist, coordinates. She knew those coordinates. Ramadi. The exact location where everything had ended. The court-martial had been swift and quiet, the kind of swift and quiet that only happened when powerful people wanted something buried. Captain Katie Morrison, the file had said, had questioned direct orders during an operation on March 14, 2018. 3 men had been killed as a result of those orders. Captain Morrison's challenge to command had, according to the official language, created confusion in the execution of tactical objectives. She'd been medically discharged 6 months later on a psychiatric evaluation she'd never had, by a psychologist who'd never examined her, signed off by the commanding officer whose orders she'd questioned, Major Marcus Webb, then. He was a general now. She didn't realize she'd moved closer to the trauma bay until she was there, her fingers reaching out to touch the edge of his file. Her hand trembled against the paper. The Special Forces insignia blazed at her from the top of the page, the same insignia that lived against her ribs in thread and faded dye, sewn into her jacket lining like a secret wound. Morrison. The voice came from behind her, low and controlled. Dr. Richard Caldwell had a voice like authority itself, measured and clean, the kind of voice that made people assume competence even when the mind behind it was something other than competent. He was tall, built like a man who'd never had to question his right to space, and his eyes had the particular coldness of someone who'd spent a career learning to weaponize institutional power. He watched her now with the intense interest of a chess player seeing an unexpected piece move, his jaw tightening just slightly. "You know this patient." It wasn't a question. Katie's hand dropped from the file. She straightened, her posture shifting into something more formal. When she turned to face Caldwell, her expression had settled into the particular blankness she kept for moments when the world threatened to become personal. "No, sir. Your hand says otherwise." His eyes were still on the file, on her hand, on the moment of weakness he'd witnessed. "Your face says otherwise. I'm ready to assist in the trauma, sir." Katie's voice had dropped an octave without her permission, a voice that belonged to someone else, someone she'd been a long time ago. She caught it and reeled it back in, forcing her next words into something smaller. "Whatever the team needs." Caldwell studied her for another 3 seconds, and she could see him cataloguing the moment, filing it away, understanding that something about her reaction to this patient was important in a way that extended beyond normal professional concern. His smile arrived then, a thin expression that never reached his eyes. "Of course. Let's see who handles this one." The trauma team assembled around Webb's gurney, the attending ER physician, Dr. Marcus Sterling, along with 2 residents and the surgical team. Katie positioned herself at the back of the bay, her hands ready, her face composed. The monitors continued their shrieking chorus. O2 sat dropping. 68%. 65. 62. The body's distress call in electronic tones. Dr. Sterling leaned over Wegg's unconscious form, already making preliminary assessments. "Bilateral pneumothorax, tension developing on the right side. We need a needle decompression." He looked up, scanning the room. His eyes found the first resident, then slid past her. "Dr. Hayes, prep for chest tube placement." Hayes stepped forward, then stopped. His hand lowered. I'm not trained for bilateral procedures, sir." "My rotation hasn't covered." He stepped back, his face reddening. Sterling's jaw tightened. "Then call surgery. Someone has to." He turned to the second resident, Dr. James Chen. "Chen, you're up." Chen looked at Webb's face, at the file still visible on the edge of the trauma bay. At the Special Forces insignia. Something flickered in his expression, recognition, maybe, or hesitation. "Sir, I'd prefer to. My patient load today has been heavy." Perhaps someone more fresh. He was already backing away from the bay, already reaching for the door. "I'll page the surgical team." "Do it," Sterling snapped. He turned to look for other hands, other doctors, anyone willing to step into the space between a crashing general and the equipment he needed to live. A nurse called out names through the intercom. Cardiothoracic surgery. ICU. Trauma surgery. And slowly, with the inevitability of cards falling in a house built on sand, 10 more physicians arrived at the edges of the trauma bay, took one look at the file, at the rank, at the Special Forces designation, and found reasons to be elsewhere. "I'm on call for pediatrics. This isn't my specialty. I have a patient in post-op. They need my attention. Trauma surgery is coming. They should handle this. This is above my clearance. I shouldn't be here." They came and went like ghosts, each one offering a reason that wasn't quite a lie, that occupied the grey space between conscience and cowardice. 12. Katie counted them without meaning to. 12 different physicians, each with their own calculation of risk and liability, each deciding in their own moment that this patient with this rank and this profound deafness and this designation of special forces was someone else's problem. The gap between the first refusal and the last was less than 90 seconds. 90 seconds of watching doctors disintegrate. Webb's O2 sat dropped to 58%. His heart rate climbed to 142. The monitors screamed. And Katie felt something inside her shift, like tumblers falling into place in a lock that had been sealed for 5 years. She moved toward the trauma bay, one step, just one, and that's when Dr. Caldwell's hand touched her arm. Not forcefully. Just a reminder. A test, maybe, to see what she would do when given permission and given refusal simultaneously. She stopped. Her hand lowered. She stepped back into the shadows behind the monitors. Because she was just a nurse. Just Morrison. Just a woman with trembling hands and a faded patch hidden under her scrubs, and the one thing she'd learned in 5 years of carrying secrets was that the moment you let them show, you stopped being invisible. You became a target. Webb's chest continued its shallow, struggling breaths. The ventilator waited, ready, but no hands moved to connect it because 12 hands had already decided this wasn't their patient. Dr. Sterling stood in the center of the chaos, looking for a solution that wasn't coming, his surgical mask catching the fluorescent light as he turned from empty space to empty space. And in the corner, in the back where the shadows pooled thick and cold, Katie Morrison felt the faded unit patch against her ribs like a heartbeat that wouldn't die, like a ghost that had just walked through those ER doors on a stretcher and recognized her standing in the dark. The quiet that followed, after the last doctor had left, after Sterling had finally managed a needle decompression with the tech's hands helping hold the patient still, that quiet was the kind that came before everything changed. Katie could taste it. Could feel it in the way the monitor's rhythm seemed to synchronize with her own breathing. Could sense it in the way Dr. Caldwell had returned to stand in the doorway, watching her not help, noting her restraint like a debt he'd eventually collect. She gripped the medication tray tighter, steadied her breathing, and waited for whatever came next. The supply closet door swung shut behind her with a pneumatic hiss. Katie was reaching for the crash cart restocking sheet when Dr. Caldwell's shadow filled the doorway, his body blocking the exit with the casual certainty of someone who'd never been told no. He was tall enough that she had to angle her chin up to meet his eyes, and she did, immediately, without hesitation. That was her first mistake. I don't know what history you have with that patient, Morrison, but you'll stay away from him. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of quiet that carries more weight than shouting. Or I'll make sure your nursing license is reviewed for emotional instability. The threat landed like a surgical blade between her ribs. Not crude. Not loud. Perfectly calculated. She'd seen him make calls before, watched him navigate the hospital's bureaucracy like a man who understood exactly which strings pulled which doors open. A license review meant interviews, documentation, a paper trail that would follow her for years. Emotional instability meant she'd never work critical care again. Possibly never work at all. Katie took one measured breath. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant frequency overhead, and somewhere down the corridor, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Her fingers found the fabric of her scrub pocket, the faded unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket, hanging just underneath. She could feel its edges through the material. That was what she held onto. A single tear escaped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it immediately. She let it fall while she met his eyes, full contact, unflinching, and then, with deliberate slowness, she raised her hand and wiped it away without breaking his gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was devastatingly calm. Each word fell like a separate weight into the silence between them. Sir, I have never abandoned a patient, and I will not start today. She stepped toward him. Not around him, toward him. He flinched, just fractionally, and she moved past into the corridor with the same unhurried precision. Behind her, she heard his breathing accelerate. She didn't turn around. The next morning, an overhead page crackled through every speaker in Sacred Heart Hospital. 200 staff members heard it. Nurses at the station froze mid-conversation. Residents in the hallway paused. The voice, administrative and impersonal, cut through the background noise like a surgical clamp. Katie, the floor nurse, report to administration for reassignment. Katie was at the medication cart on the 3rd floor, drawing up propofol for a post-op patient. She didn't pause. Her hands continued their work, needle in the vial, plunger steady, measurements exact, while every eye in the vicinity turned toward her. Someone whispered something. Someone else responded. The nickname echoed down the corridors afterward, cementing the reduction. Not Major Morrison. Not Senior Nurse Morrison. Just Katie. The floor nurse. Something small. Something dismissible. She finished her medication round and walked to administration with her head high, her limp invisible through sheer will. The reassignment paperwork was already on the desk. Night shift rotation. Basic care assignments only. No critical patients. No ICU access. No senior privileges. Caldwell's signature was on the form, but it was the hospital administrator's, the one who owed Caldwell a favor from 3 years ago, some private matter involving the administrator's brother-in-law, that made it official. By Friday evening, 12 doctors had refused to treat General Webb. 12. Katie had counted them on her shift roster, noting the pattern. Caldwell had made calculated calls to each one over the course of the week, planting seeds with surgical precision. To Dr. Hayes, he'd mentioned insurance complications. To Dr. Bennett, he'd cited liability concerns with the patient's communication barriers. To the surgical team, he'd suggested they lacked specialized experience managing deaf trauma patients. The calls were professional, courteous, lethal. The parking lot humiliation happened at 3:36 p.m., just as the incoming night shift was arriving. 30 staff members were making their way across the asphalt toward the employee entrance when Caldwell appeared beside Katie's car, his voice carrying across the open space like a broadcast. Effective immediately, Katie will be reassigned to night rotation basic care. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Intention carries further than volume. She lacks the judgment for critical patients. A younger nurse, barely 2 years into her career, whispered loudly enough to be heard, "Isn't she the one who froze when that general came in?" Katie stood perfectly still. The weight of 30 pairs of eyes pressed against her like physical force. The asphalt beneath her feet was still radiating heat from the Houston afternoon, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, ambulance coming in, but still far enough away that it was just background noise. Caldwell had orchestrated this perfectly. The timing. The audience. The witnesses. She absorbed each word with measured breaths. One tear tracked down her face, deliberate, visible, controlled. She wiped it without breaking eye contact with Caldwell. The gesture was a statement. The eye contact was a promise. "I understand, Dr. Caldwell. I'll report at 11. She turned and walked to her car. Her limp was more pronounced under the weight of humiliation, but her spine was straight. Her colleagues watched in silence as she drove away, the dust settling behind her on the parking lot like a period at the end of a sentence. That night, she started her reassignment on the lowest priority ward. Basic vitals. Medication rounds. Turning patients every 2 hours. The work was menial in a way that made every muscle in her body tense with controlled fury. She'd performed surgery with her bare hands in Ramadi. She'd held organs together with strips of combat tape and will. And now she was refilling water pitchers. Webb had been moved to ICU on day 3 of his admission, his condition deteriorating with each hour that passed while the 12 refusing doctors maintained their distance. The internal injuries that should have been addressed immediately were festering. His lung pressure was building. The tension that no one was treating was slowly suffocating him from the inside, a collapse waiting to happen. Katie's administrative access to the ICU had been revoked. She didn't test it. She didn't try the door and accept the failure. She simply worked her basic care rounds on the lower floors and listened to the ventilation system that connected every room in Sacred Heart to every other room. At 1:36 a.m. on her third night shift, the alarm screamed down through the metal ducts with a pattern she recognized instantly. Cardiac arrest. The monitor's pitch was specific, the shrill electronic wail that meant flat line. She ran for the stairs. Her left leg screamed with each impact, old shrapnel injury from Ramadi, the kind of pain that was information, data, feedback about what her body could still do. She was climbing 3 flights at full speed, her muscles remembering what training had taught them. The back stairwell was empty. Security would be slower, taking the main elevators. Caldwell had engineered perfect isolation. When she reached ICU, she knew before she opened the door that the room would be empty. No doctors. No response team. No one. She'd seen this move before, the calculated absence that wasn't quite abandonment, wasn't quite negligence, but was precisely calculated to look like both. Webb's room was a tableau of failure. His chest wasn't moving. His lips had a bluish tint. Every monitor was flatlined, the screens displaying the absence of life like a verdict. The clock on the wall read 1:48. He had for minutes before brain damage became permanent. Maybe less. Katie's hands stopped trembling. She didn't call for help. She didn't page the team. She didn't follow protocol. Instead, she moved the way combat medic training had wired her to move, autopilot superseding hesitation, muscle memory dissolving doubt. The crash cart was 3 feet to her left. The crash button was on the wall. She activated both simultaneously, knowing neither would deliver a response in time. Webb's eyes fluttered open for 1 second, recognition flickering like a dying bulb. He saw her face and his hands moved, weak, uncoordinated, signing against his own chest in ASL. She understood the movement, you. Then he crashed completely. Katie moved without thinking. The combat knife wasn't in her equipment anymore, but the scalpel on the crash cart would work. She'd done this before in a fire support base outside Fallujah with a field-expedient thoracotomy, her hands moving through the intercostal spaces with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed the anatomy 1,000 times. The 2nd and 5th intercostal spaces. The midclavicular line. Depth of 4 centimeters. She knew every measurement. Behind her, security radios crackled to life on someone's shoulder. Caldwell had been alerted. She reached for the scalpel, and the entire hospital held its breath. Night shift at Sacred Heart meant the basement floors, pediatrics, chronic care, the patients who weren't dying fast enough to matter. Katie Morrison clipped her badge to her scrubs at 11 p.m. and walked past the ICU elevators without looking up. 2 weeks of reassignment had taught her the geography of invisibility, the blind spots in the surveillance system, the stairwells where no one congregated, the medication supply room that faced away from the nursing station. She'd mapped this hospital like it was hostile territory, because it was. Her assignment tonight was routine vitals and medication rounds on the 3rd floor, blood pressure checks every 4 hours, insulin injections at midnight and 4 a.m., documentation that would satisfy protocol and nothing else. Standard night nurse work. The kind of work that required no presence, no judgment, no existence beyond the charting system. Caldwell had been explicit about the logistics, keep her away from critical care. Keep her moving through the low acuity floors where the problems were contained and manageable. Keep her where General Marcus Webb couldn't possibly cross her path, where she couldn't possibly become entangled in his deteriorating condition. What Caldwell hadn't explicitly said, but what Katie understood with crystalline clarity, was that every physician who might treat Webb had been systematically removed from that possibility. The cards had been played with surgical precision. Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd expressed willingness to work with deaf patients using ASL interpreters, had been transferred to the satellite clinic in League City. Dr. Marcus Okonkwo, who specialized in trauma and had no institutional loyalty to Caldwell's faction, had been assigned to the county hospital rotation starting Monday. Dr. James Halloway, who'd worked military medicine in Kandahar and understood combat injuries, had been called to testify as an expert witness in a malpractice trial 2 hours north. The surgical team, all of them, had been locked into a complicated pediatric reconstruction case that would run through the night and into the morning shift. No relief scheduled. No substitutes available. The architecture of sabotage was elegant in its simplicity. Caldwell had made phone calls. Katie would learn later that 12 doctors had been approached, offered subtle pressure, promised minor favors, or simply informed that treating General Webb would invite complications, reviews, insurance complications, questions about their licensure. 12 refusals. A wall of white coats all turning away at the same moment. She'd also lost her ICU access codes. The electronic locks responded to her badge with a soft red blink now, a rejection that felt personal. Her authorization had been revoked through our system at 7:16 that morning. She'd watched the notification appear on the computer screen and said nothing. The message was clear: don't even try. Your presence is not welcome where your skills might matter. The institution had spoken. Katie moved through the third floor on autopilot, hitting vitals on Mrs. Chen in 312, blood pressure elevated, heart rate steady, and moving to Mr. Valdez in 315, whose diabetes management required precision but no emergency intervention. The work was honest work. The patients deserved her attention. She gave them her whole focus, the way she'd been trained, because the alternative was to think about what was happening 6 floors above her, in a room she could no longer access, with a patient no doctor was assigned to check on with any meaningful frequency. At 1:02 a.m., Katie was in the medication room, drawing up the 2 o'clock insulin shots, when she heard it through the overhead pages, 3 monotone beeps. The signal for all hands notification. The intercom crackled. Code Blue, ICU 4. Code Blue, ICU 4. All available personnel respond. ICU 4 was Webb's room. Katie's hands went still. The insulin pen hung suspended between the drawer and the medication tray. The world compressed into a single point of focus, the time stamp on the speaker, the hollow urgency of the overhead page, the absence of any specific physician name being called. When a code blue came through, the operator usually called the attending physician by name, the charge nurse, the rapid response team lead. This time, nothing. Just the room number, the alert, the invitation for anyone, everyone, no one, to respond. She set down the insulin pen with precision. Closed the medication drawer. Walked out of the supply room and toward the stairwell. The elevator would be faster. 3 seconds maybe. But the stairwell was her route. The stairwell didn't have witnesses. Katie moved up the concrete stairs, 6 flights, her shoes barely whispering against the steps. Her breath stayed level. Her pulse stayed controlled. This wasn't panic. This was recognition. This was the moment she'd known was coming since the first time she'd seen Caldwell's face in the corridor, since the moment he'd understood that she might be a liability, since he'd decided that preventing her from helping Webb was worth orchestrating a careful, competent campaign of institutional destruction. The ICU corridor was quiet. Fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical drone. The glass partitions around each room stood dark except for Webb's. Monitors glowed with their chaotic choreography, beeping wildly, his monitor screen showing a rhythm that wasn't quite asystole but wasn't anything the body should be producing either. Tension pneumothorax, she recognized instantly. His right chest had collapsed, the pressure compressing his heart, squeezing the blood vessels, choking the oxygen pathways. His chest didn't rise. His lips had begun to show cyanosis, that pale blue shadow of oxygen starvation. The monitor showed a heart rate climbing toward 200, fast, frantic, unsustainable, and blood pressure dropping with each beat. He had maybe 10 minutes. Maybe less. The room was empty of physicians. Not understaffed. Empty. No resident at the bedside, no attending standing by, no nursing supervisor checking vitals. Just the monitors screaming into the silence, and a patient whose brain was dying with every second the pressure built against his heart. Katie stepped into the room and the monitor's chaos swallowed her whole. The hiss of the ventilator. The sharp beeping of the pulse oximeter. The rhythmic alarm of the blood pressure cuff recycling, recording numbers that fell like a stone, 94. 87, 81. 76. The crash cart sat against the far wall, untouched. The defibrillator pads hung unused. No one had come. No one was coming. She moved to Webb's bedside. 6 feet away, 8 feet away, distance evaporated. His neck bore the landmarks she needed, the clavicle, the first rib, the intercostal space at the second rib, midclavicular line. She could feel the landmarks through muscle memory that belonged to her hands, not her conscious mind. Her fingers found the space, measured it, confirmed it. This was where the pressure was building. This was where the trapped air was squeezing his heart into uselessness. Katie turned to the crash cart and found the emergency intubation tray. No scalpel, but there, trauma shears, standard issue in every crash cart. She pulled them free and walked back to Webb's chest. Her hands moved with the detached precision of someone performing a procedure she'd done in a firefight in Ramadi, with artillery hammering the forward operating base and 3 men bleeding out around her, and this same patient, then Lieutenant Webb, now unconscious and oxygen-starved, lying in front of her with his bad order still ringing in her ears. The shears cut through the hospital gown and the underlying mesh. She felt the skin give, that slight resistance and release that meant she'd breached the correct depth. The air came out in a soft hiss, the distinctive sound of pressure releasing, of a pneumothorax decompressing, of a body getting a second chance at breathing. Webb's chest drew in. The ventilator found resistance that disappeared. His oxygen saturation, which had been plummeting toward the 20s, began to climb. 24, 31. 39, 47. The heart rate, which had been wild and panicked, began to settle into something approaching reason. His blood pressure held steady, then rose, 78/52. Not good, but not disintegrating. Not yet. She signed to him anyway, though his eyes were closed, though he couldn't see her hands moving, stay with me, her fingers spelling against the air above his chest. General, stay with me. The same word she'd used in Ramadi when she'd held his hand while the medevac helicopter landed, when she'd told him 3 men were dead because of his order, when he'd looked at her with something breaking in his expression and whispered, "I'm sorry, Morrison. I'm sorry." Katie stayed. She monitored his vitals personally, refusing to leave the room, refusing to call for help through official channels that Caldwell had closed to her. The minutes accumulated, 1 hour, 2, 3. The monitors began to show stability. His oxygen saturation climbed toward acceptable levels. His heart rhythm regularized. His blood pressure stabilized, then improved. By 4 a.m., Webb was breathing steadily, his body no longer in the active process of dying, his brain no longer starving for oxygen, his heartbeat no longer panicked and frantic. By 5 a.m., dawn was breaking across Houston through the ICU windows, painting everything gold. The monitors showed a patient returning to baseline, a body that had been yanked back from the edge and was, slowly, remembering how to live. Katie felt the exhaustion hit her like a physical weight. Her hands were finally trembling, not from fear, but from the specific kind of fatigue that came from being fully present for 5 hours without rest, without backup, without the security of a team around her. She leaned against the wall beside Webb's bed and let herself feel the cost of keeping him alive. The ICU doors opened at 5:33 a.m. 2 security guards entered first, their uniforms crisp, their presence official. Caldwell followed, his white coat immaculate, his expression arranged into a mask of professional concern that somehow managed to convey satisfaction underneath. He was carrying a tablet, and Katie understood without being told that he'd been waiting for this moment, had perhaps been monitoring the room remotely, had known the moment she'd crossed the threshold into protocol violation. "Nurse Morrison." His voice was smooth. "We need to discuss what happened here tonight." Katie straightened. Her hands stopped trembling. Her breath came steady. "Unauthorized surgical procedure." Caldwell turned the tablet toward her. On the screen, the emergency intubation documentation, the crash cart records, the lack of physician oversight, the complete absence of the chain of command that should have authorized what she'd done. "I've documented every deviation. Unauthorized equipment use. Unauthorized intervention. The patient is alive, yes, but at what cost to our liability? At what cost to your licensure? The guards were moving closer, their posture neutral but their intent clear. This was an escort situation. Katie met Caldwell's eyes. He was coding. No physician present. Exactly. Caldwell's smile was thin. Which is why you should have called for an attending, not taken matters into your own hands. Now we have a critical incident report, an incident that will require investigation, an incident that will raise questions about your judgment. He wasn't finished, he was simply pausing, letting the weight of institutional power settle. Around them, the ICU day shift was beginning to arrive, nurses clocking in, physicians moving through the unit. Caldwell had timed this perfectly. They would all see. They would all understand that Nurse Morrison, the quiet one, the reassigned one, the one without clearance, had done something unauthorized and was now being removed. You're being escorted out pending investigation. Caldwell held up a folder, her personnel file. Your badge is being deactivated effective immediately. We'll need you to surrender it before you leave. Katie unclipped her badge from her scrubs. The weight of it had been so familiar she'd stopped noticing it. She handed it to Caldwell, and he took it without comment, without acknowledgement, without anything except the simple transaction of power shifting. The guards led her out of the ICU. Past the nurse's station. Past her colleagues, whose eyes all moved away at the moment they might have met hers. Past the monitor displays showing Webb's steady vital signs, the evidence of what she'd done, the proof of her intervention, the reason for her removal all at once. The doors closed behind her. The security escort didn't speak during the walk. Neither did Katie. The fluorescent lights cast everything in surgical white as they moved through the corridor, the same hallway she'd walked 1,000 times, now transformed into the passage between her old life and whatever came next. Her wet scrubs clung to her ribs. Blood that wasn't hers had soaked through at the cuffs. At 2:24 a.m., she'd held a man's life between her hands for 5 hours straight, and now at 7:34 a.m., the only evidence was the institutional silence closing around her like a fist. The elevator doors opened. Closed. The descent felt like sinking. HR processed her termination in 17 minutes. Forms. Signature lines. Her badge returned with the plastic still warm from the laminator. The administrator wouldn't meet her eyes, that particular kind of cowardice that comes from witnessing something you're not brave enough to address. Katie signed where indicated, her hand steady, her composure the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The woman across the desk kept talking about next steps and severance packages, but Katie had stopped listening somewhere around unauthorized medical intervention. She left Sacred Heart Hospital with her life in a manila folder and nothing else. The rain started the moment she reached her car. Not a drizzle. Not a suggestion of weather. Rain that hammered the windshield like accusations, like fists, like the universe reminding her that mercy and consequence arrived in the same package. She didn't drive home. Home was an empty apartment with Daniel's coffee mug still in the cabinet and his field jacket hanging in the closet where she'd left it for 5 years, because removing it felt like admitting he wasn't coming back. Instead, she drove to Calvary Cemetery on the south side of Houston where the live oaks bent low under the weight of the storm, and where a granite stone bore his name in letters that would outlast her. Catherine Ellen Morrison loved this man. 1989 to 2013. Katie knelt in the mud. Not the kind of kneeling that happens in churches. The kind that happens when your knees give out from carrying something too heavy. Rain mixed with her tears, or maybe it was all rain, maybe she couldn't cry anymore, maybe that reservoir had emptied somewhere in an ICU at 2:13 a.m. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone, feeling the water run between her fingers, and the words came from somewhere she didn't know still existed. I saved him, Daniel. Her voice was barely audible beneath the storm. I saved the man who destroyed us both, and they're taking everything away again. I don't know how to keep fighting. The cemetery offered no answer. Just rain and the sound of wind moving through the oak branches like something breathing in the darkness. Katie's limp had returned, always did when she stood too long, when the shrapnel in her right leg decided to remind her it was still there. She pressed both hands against the stone now, her fingers spread wide, and for the first time in 5 years, she let herself break. Not in public. Not where anyone could see. But here, alone with her dead husband, with the weight of a decision that had saved a man and destroyed her in the same motion. Inside her soaked jacket, against her ribs, she felt it. The unit patch. Webb's own insignia, faded from years of carrying it next to her heart, the colors worn soft, the edges frayed where she'd pulled it out 1,000 times in the dark, holding it the way people hold crucifixes. He'd torn it from his uniform the day of the court-martial. March 2018. The hearing room in Ramadi that smelled like diesel fuel and death and the particular stench of careers being dismantled. Webb had found her afterward in a supply tent, where she'd been trying to breathe without hyperventilating, and he'd pressed the patch into her palm with trembling hands that matched nothing about his public composure. "You were right," he'd whispered. "And I'm sorry." 3 years later, Daniel was dead. The mission had gone catastrophic. Webb's order to abandon the wounded had gotten 3 men killed, and when Katie had refused to leave them, when she'd stayed behind and pulled 12 men from a kill zone under fire, Daniel had come back for her. He'd stepped on a pressure-triggered IED 3 meters from the extraction point. They'd found his left boot but not his foot. Katie had carried that unit patch ever since. Never shown it to anyone. Never explained why a nurse wore the insignia of a command that had court-martialed her. It was evidence and talisman and confession all at once, proof that even the man who destroyed her knew he was wrong. And she'd just saved his life. The irony was so complete, so vicious in its perfection, that Katie actually laughed. Just once. A sound like a rifle shot in the rain. Back at Sacred Heart Hospital, something was happening that Katie didn't know about yet. HR had processed her final termination paperwork, and in doing so, had run the standard background check for security clearance. The system had found something unusual. Something that shouldn't exist for someone titled RN Katie Morrison. A classified security clearance. Active. Top secret. Special Operations Command clearance. The notification had routed automatically to FBI Field Office Houston. Agent Maria Torres had opened the file at 9:15 a.m. and seen the deployment dates, Ramadi 2018. Special Operations. Medal citations with redactions so heavy they looked like someone had dragged a permanent marker across entire years. She'd made 3 calls in sequence. First to SOCOM headquarters. Second to General Marcus Webb's listed next of kin. Third to Sacred Heart's legal department, with 4 words that changed everything: freeze all termination proceedings. Dr. Richard Caldwell had celebrated too early. At 10:53 a.m., while Katie knelt in the rain, he'd poured expensive scotch in his office and reviewed his documentation, every falsified record, every carefully maintained lie. He'd buried the malpractice involving Webb's nephew 2 years ago. Marcus Webb Jr. had been a patient in the ICU with acute compartment syndrome, and Caldwell's delayed fasciotomy had resulted in permanent nerve damage. Katie had been there. She'd seen it. She'd even asked questions. But Katie had been reassigned before she could connect the dots, and by the time she might have figured it out, he'd reorganized the entire case file. Then Webb had arrived unconscious. Then Katie had recognized him. Then Caldwell had realized that if Katie spent enough time with Webb, if she had access, if she started asking questions about his medical history, about why the general might have enemies here, about what might have happened to his nephew, she'd connect everything. So he'd removed her. Strategic. Competent. Clean. His phone rang at 11:36 a.m. The hospital's legal department. Their voices were urgent in a way that made his stomach drop. Dr. Caldwell, the FBI is requesting all personnel files related to Katie Morrison and General Webb. You need to come to administration immediately. Katie was still in the cemetery when her phone buzzed. A voicemail from hospital administration. Dry, formal, offering no information except a time and a location. The lobby of Sacred Heart Hospital. 2 p.m. She didn't know what awaited her. She didn't know that agents had already opened her classified file. She didn't know that Webb's daughter had already called, that a SEAL team commander had already offered to personally escort Katie to wherever she needed to be, that the FBI had already documented every instance of Caldwell's sabotage and falsified records. She only knew that she'd saved a man and lost everything, and that sometimes those two things happened at the exact same moment. Rain still hammered the windshield. Katie pulled away from the cemetery and drove toward Sacred Heart, still wearing soaked scrubs, still carrying Webb's unit patch against her heart, still completely unaware that the entire trajectory of her life was about to pivot on the next 30 minutes. The storm followed her across Houston like a witness. HR processed the termination paperwork in her name at 3:24 p.m. on a Wednesday. Standard procedure. Routine. Unremarkable in every way until the background check system flagged something buried in Katie's file from 2018. A classified security clearance notation. Military service record. Compartmentalized access codes from the Pentagon that should have never existed in a civilian nursing database. The algorithm didn't know what to do with it. So it routed the entire file directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Houston field office. 12 minutes later, a special agent named Reeves was reading Katie Morrison's actual file, not the one Sacred Heart had been given during hiring. Not the one Caldwell had altered and hidden. The real one. Webb's daughter arrived at 4:15 p.m. through the main lobby entrance, and she didn't walk. She moved like someone carrying a message too important for quiet delivery. Behind her came Commander Hayes in dress blues, the SEAL team leader who'd piloted the helicopter. Behind him came 6 more operators in civilian clothes, the kind of casual that only covers military bearing if you're not looking closely. They were looking closely. The entire lobby went quiet the way rooms do when something shifts in the air pressure. She approached the main desk where 3 nurses were frozen in the moment of recognizing something massive was happening. Webb's daughter raised her voice high enough to carry across the atrium. Not angry. Cracking with emotion. You will address her as Major Morrison. Not a request. Not a question. A command delivered with the precision of someone used to giving them. She is Major Catherine Morrison, United States Army Special Forces Medical Unit, and you will treat her with the respect she has earned with her blood. The nurse administrator appeared within 90 seconds, summoned by calls that hadn't needed to be made yet. She held a file in her trembling hands. Not Caldwell's fabricated version. The real one. She opened it with the care of someone handling something fragile and irreplaceable. Her voice shook as she read aloud in the lobby where 30 people were now standing. Major Catherine Morrison, Special Forces Medical Unit, Ramadi 2018. She paused. Every word had weight. Bronze Star. Silence. Bronze Star with Vela device. The administrator's hand steadied slightly as she continued. 2 purple hearts. Webb's daughter closed her eyes. Commander Hayes stepped forward then, his presence moving like a glacier, slow and absolutely unmovable. When he spoke, his voice came out like a tank idling in a garage, low and carrying the weight of authority that needs no amplification. Distinguished Service Cross for actions under fire. She saved 12 men including General Webb when his orders went sideways in Fallujah. The commander paused. The pause was deliberate. It was a technique. That's the kind of person standing in your hallway. That's the person your hospital destroyed. An FBI agent named Reeves appeared at 4:52 p.m., moving with the quiet efficiency of someone used to being the most important person in every room. She wasn't loud. She didn't need to be. She simply stood beside Webb's daughter and began speaking facts. Major Morrison was a material witness to the incident that ended her career in Ramadi. Not the cause. A witness. The agent opened her own file. Dr. Richard Caldwell attempted to forge her employment records to cover his own malpractice involving General Webb's nephew, Marcus Webb Jr., who died in 2019 from complications Dr. Caldwell caused and then buried in falsified records. The air in the lobby didn't just go quiet. It went heavy. Webb's daughter provided testimony. Commander Hayes provided his deposition from the helicopter. The SEAL team provided operational records showing Katie's actual service record, the one Sacred Heart never checked. The FBI had been watching Caldwell for 6 weeks already, but they were waiting. Waiting for Katie to save Webb. Waiting for him to move. And he had. So they moved. Caldwell's medical licenses were revoked in Texas, California, Florida, and New York by 6:44 p.m. His strategic moves, every reassignment, every altered schedule, every restricted access code, were traced through hospital systems by 7:15 p.m. The pattern revealed itself like a map of deliberate cruelty spanning 2 years. 3 other staff members had been systematically forced out when they questioned his decisions. 1 nurse had quit after 18 months. 1 respiratory therapist had transferred to San Antonio. 1 surgical tech had simply stopped showing up after Caldwell made a phone call. Criminal charges stacked like surgical instruments: fraud, obstruction, falsifying medical records, attempted evidence tampering, practicing medicine under fraud, negligent homicide in the case of Marcus Webb Jr. Sacred Heart's board called an emergency session at 11 p.m. By midnight, they'd authorized a wrongful termination settlement with Katie for undisclosed amounts and prepared a formal apology for the Houston Chronicle. By 1 a.m., they'd extended an offer for the director of emergency medicine position. 2 months later, Katie's car rolled past a strip mall on Westheimer Road while she was driving to physical therapy. She'd rebuilt her shoulders and hips through months of rehabilitation. The limp remained, but she no longer hid it. Through the storefront window of Henderson Insurance, affordable rates, she saw him sitting at a folding table. Rumpled suit. No white coat. No stethoscope. No power. His hands were idle on a desk empty of clients. His medical career was destroyed. His reputation ruined. His strategic brilliance reduced to cold calling potential customers who'd see his face and remember what he'd tried to do. Caldwell looked up. He saw Katie through the glass. She held his gaze for 1 measured breath, her composure absolute, her quiet dignity carrying more weight than any words could have. Then she continued walking. No words needed. His destruction was complete and he knew exactly who'd witnessed it. Webb recovered fully at Sacred Heart. His daughter visited daily, interpreting his signs into spoken words that nobody else could understand. Commander Hayes brought the unit. They filled his room with stories that required no sound. The kind of camaraderie that lives in silence and shoulder touches and the simple fact of presence. Katie checked on him professionally during her final week before accepting the director position, maintaining the distance that protocol required, her quiet authority holding him at arm's length. He destroyed her career once. She saved his life twice. Even. Nothing more needed to be said. But Webb's daughter caught her in the hallway on his discharge day. He needs to see you. Not as his nurse. As Major Morrison. Please. Katie's hand moved instinctively to her jacket where the unit patch remained, faded and worn. The patch he'd torn from his own uniform 5 years ago. He gave that to you, didn't he? The daughter asked quietly. Katie nodded once. Then you know he's been carrying guilt for 5 years. Let him speak. 1 measured breath. Katie agreed. Her first day as director of emergency medicine began at 6 a.m. Her name was on the office door. Her military decorations hung framed on the wall beside her medical credentials, no longer hidden. Her name tag read Major Catherine Morrison, RN, Director. She wore the rank openly now. When she opened her office, General Marcus Webb was already there, waiting in full dress uniform, his daughter beside him as interpreter. The moment the door closed, Webb lowered himself to 1 knee before her, his hand signing with visible trembling. His daughter spoke the words aloud, her voice thick with the weight of them. You saved my life twice. Once in Ramadi when you were right and I was wrong. Once here when I didn't deserve it. Forgive me, Major. Katie stood perfectly still, absorbing the moment with 1 measured breath. She reached inside her white coat and removed the faded unit patch, his Special Forces insignia, carried against her ribs for 5 years. She placed it in his palm and signed back clearly. "You already asked forgiveness once, General. I heard you then. I just needed to hear myself again." Webb closed his hand around the patch, his tears falling like rain on hot asphalt. He rose, and they stood as equals. Two soldiers who'd survived the same nightmare from different sides. That evening, Katie returned to Daniel's grave one final time. The stone was cold beneath her palm. "I finally understand," she whispered. "Sometimes saving someone means losing everything first. I'm okay now. I promise." She straightened her jacket and walked back to her car with steady steps. The radio dispatch crackled. "Incoming trauma." She started the engine and responded. "Morrison en route." Her voice was calm, certain, unbroken. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'm curious, comment below and tell us if you're watching this alone or with family. Now let's see how this unfolds.